Charles Arthur Floyd entered the world on February 3, 1904, near Adairsville in Bartow County, Georgia. He was born into a family that already knew hardship well. His father, Walter Lee Floyd, and his mother, Mamie Helena Eccles Floyd, were rural Georgians scraping out a living in a region where farming offered little security and no margin for error. The land was unforgiving, and so was the economy that surrounded it. Floyd's birth placed him squarely inside that reality, one shaped by poverty, instability, and the quiet pressure of survival that would define much of his early life. In 1911, when Charles Floyd was still a child, his family joined the steady westward movement of struggling farmers looking for a way out. Walter and Mamie Floyd packed up what they had and left Georgia behind, relocating to eastern Oklahoma. They settled near the small farming communities of Akins and Sallisaw in Sequoyah County, close to the Arkansas border. It was a region of rough land and thin opportunity, populated by families like the Floyds who were chasing the promise of stability that Oklahoma had begun to advertise. For young Charles, the move severed his ties to Georgia and placed him in the Cookson Hills, an isolated stretch of country that would later play a central role in his life. By his teenage years, Charles Floyd was fully shaped by the grind of rural Oklahoma. He worked long days on tenant farms around Akins and Sallisaw, labor that paid little and offered even less hope of getting ahead. The Floyd family lived close to foreclosure, like many others in Sequoyah County, and survival often mattered more than legality. During this period, Charles learned to make and transport illegal liquor, a common sideline in the region where bootlegging blurred into everyday life. It was also during these years that he picked up the nickname Choc, a reference to his fondness for Choctaw beer, a homemade brew popular in the area. The name stuck locally, and it marked the beginning of his reputation as someone willing to step outside the rules when honest work failed to provide a way forward. Between 1921 and 1924, Charles Floyd tried to anchor himself to a more conventional life. In 1921, he married Ruby Hardgrave, the daughter of a tenant farmer, and for a time he appeared to be following the same path as many young men in the Cookson Hills. The couple settled into the rhythms of rural Oklahoma and later welcomed a son, Jack Dempsey Floyd, named after the heavyweight boxing champion. But marriage and fatherhood did not ease the pressures that had shaped Floyd since childhood. Work was irregular, money came and went, and the land offered no real future. Despite his attachment to Ruby and their child, financial instability remained constant, and the frustration of being unable to provide steadily began to pull Floyd away from farm life and toward choices that would carry lasting consequences. In September of 1925, Charles Floyd crossed a line that could not be stepped back from. He left Oklahoma and traveled east to St. Louis, Missouri, where he took part in a payroll robbery that brought in more money than anything he had seen before. The exact date of the robbery is reported differently in the records, but there is no dispute about the outcome. Floyd was identified, arrested, and charged for his role in the crime. The arrest came quickly, helped along by the sudden change in his appearance and spending, something local police found hard to ignore. Floyd was convicted in Missouri court and sentenced to 5 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. Prison marked a turning point. It ended any remaining pretense that he was drifting into crime by accident. Inside, he was surrounded by seasoned criminals and learned lessons that went far beyond farm life or bootlegging. When the cell doors closed behind him, Floyd entered a system that hardened men and refined their methods. By the time he would leave, he would not be the same man who arrived from the Cookson Hills looking for fast money. By 1929, Charles Floyd's first prison sentence was coming to an end. After serving roughly 3.5 years of his 5-year term at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City, he was granted parole and released back into the world. The timing was not kind. The country was sliding toward economic collapse, and for a man with a criminal record and no stable trade, legitimate opportunities were scarce. Earlier that same year, while Floyd was still behind bars, Ruby Floyd filed for divorce. She cited neglect and the strain of raising their young son alone while her husband was incarcerated. Floyd did not contest the proceedings and Ruby was awarded custody of Jack Dempsey Floyd. The marriage was over before Charles ever walked free. When he left prison in 1929, he did so alone, separated from his family and carrying the reputation of a convicted robber. The combination of freedom, isolation, and limited prospects set the conditions for what came next. After his release in 1929, Charles Floyd did not return to the Cookson Hills. Instead, he headed straight for Kansas City, Missouri, a place where crime operated in the open and protection could be bought. The city's underworld was firmly established, shaped by political corruption and dominated by figures who understood how to keep law enforcement at arm's length. For Floyd, Kansas City offered something Oklahoma never could: opportunity, anonymity, and access to experienced criminals who treated robbery as a profession rather than a risk. It was in Kansas City that Floyd became fully immersed in organized criminal networks. He learned new methods, refined his use of firearms, and began working with other professional criminals moving money through the Midwest. During this period, he acquired the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Accounts differ on how it originated, but multiple sources agree it was first used in Kansas City and stuck despite his open dislike of it. From that point forward, Charles Floyd was no longer known simply as Choc from Oklahoma. In police files and newspaper headlines, he became Pretty Boy Floyd, a name that marked his transition from small-time criminal into a figure of national attention. Between 1929 and 1930, Charles Floyd's criminal activity intensified and became more deliberate. Operating across the Midwest, he shifted from small-scale theft into armed highway and bank robberies, often targeting payrolls and financial institutions. These crimes were no longer impulsive. They showed planning, mobility, and a growing confidence in his ability to move quickly across state lines. During this period, Floyd was arrested several times in different jurisdictions, including Kansas City, Akron, and Toledo. Charges ranged from vagrancy and suspicion of robbery to murder allegations connected to armed holdups. Each time, he managed to avoid permanent confinement, either through lack of evidence, short sentences, or release shortly after arrest. Law enforcement agencies were still fragmented, and Floyd exploited those gaps, disappearing before cases could be fully built against him. By the end of 1930, he was no longer a local criminal slipping through cracks. He was becoming a known figure to police across multiple states, and his name was beginning to circulate beyond regional files. On November 24, 1930, Charles Floyd finally faced a conviction that appeared capable of ending his run. He was found guilty for his role in the robbery of the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Sylvania, Ohio, and sentenced to a term of 12 to 15 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. For law enforcement, the sentence looked decisive. Floyd was no longer a suspect slipping out of custody. He was a convicted bank robber headed for long-term imprisonment. That confinement did not last. While being transported under guard, Floyd escaped custody, vanishing before he could be fully absorbed into the prison system. The details of the escape were simple and embarrassing for authorities. He exploited lax security and disappeared back into the Midwest, free once again. The escape marked a turning point. He was now viewed as a fugitive who had beaten the system, and law enforcement interest in him hardened accordingly. Between March and July of 1931, Charles Floyd crossed into a far darker phase of his criminal life. What had begun as armed robbery now carried fatal consequences, and his name became tied to killings that could not be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states began linking Floyd and the men who moved with him to violent encounters that ended in death. On April 23, 1931, Patrolman R.H. Kastner of Bowling Green, Ohio, was killed during an attempted bank robbery. The shooting occurred when officers confronted Floyd and his associates in the street. Gunfire erupted, and Kastner was struck and killed. Floyd escaped the scene, but from that point forward, he was no longer viewed as a robber who might avoid bloodshed. A police officer was dead, and Floyd was now considered a lethal threat. Just 3 months later, on July 22, 1931, federal agent Curtis C. Burke was shot and killed in Kansas City, Missouri. Burke had been involved in pursuing Floyd and other wanted criminals operating in the region. The killing of a federal agent sharply escalated the response from authorities. Floyd was identified as the gunman responsible, and his status shifted again from dangerous fugitive to a man directly accused of killing law enforcement officers. By the end of that summer, Floyd's reputation had changed permanently. He was no longer chased solely for stolen money or escaped sentences. He was now associated with the deaths of men wearing badges, and that distinction ensured that future encounters with law enforcement would end one way or another. On April 7, 1932, Charles Floyd's path collided again with Oklahoma law enforcement, this time with deadly consequences. Irv Kelly, a former sheriff of McIntosh County who had turned bounty hunter, tracked Floyd near Bixby, Oklahoma. Kelly was no longer acting as a local peace officer, but as a man paid to bring fugitives in, dead or alive, a common practice in that era. When Kelly attempted to arrest Floyd, the encounter quickly turned violent. Gunfire broke out and Kelly was shot. He later died from his wounds. Authorities identified Floyd as the man who pulled the trigger, adding another confirmed killing to his record. The shooting reinforced Floyd's reputation as someone who would not surrender and would use lethal force to avoid capture. From that point on, any attempt to take him alive was understood to carry serious risk, both for local officers and for federal agents now increasingly focused on stopping him. During 1931 and 1932, Charles Floyd reached the height of his criminal activity in Oklahoma. He moved quickly across the state, targeting small-town banks that were lightly guarded and often unprepared for armed robbery. In several documented cases, he struck more than one bank in a single day, including robberies in towns only miles apart. These were not reckless acts. They were calculated, relying on speed, local knowledge, and the limited ability of rural law enforcement to coordinate across counties. As these robberies piled up, Floyd's reputation among the public began to change. Newspapers reported the crimes in dramatic language, and stories spread that he destroyed mortgage documents during hold-ups or used stolen money to help struggling families. There is no verified evidence that he regularly burned mortgages or redistributed cash, and historians have been clear that much of this image belongs to folklore rather than record. Still, in Depression-era Oklahoma, the idea took hold. Banks were widely blamed for foreclosures and lost farms, and Floyd became a symbol for anger that already existed. Locals in parts of eastern Oklahoma sheltered him, warned him of approaching officers, and referred to him as the Robin Hood of the Cookson Hills. The protection he received made capture difficult and reinforced the divide between public sentiment and law enforcement reality. To the authorities, Floyd was a violent fugitive responsible for multiple deaths. To many people living under economic pressure, he was seen as someone striking back at institutions they distrusted. That gap between myth and fact widened during these years, even as Floyd himself continued to rely on robbery and violence to stay ahead of the law. On the morning of June 17, 1933, violence erupted outside Union Station in Kansas City, Missouri, in an event that would become known as the Kansas City Massacre. Frank "Jelly" Nash, a veteran bank robber who had escaped federal custody years earlier, was being transported by law enforcement after his recapture in Arkansas. As officers escorted Nash from the station toward a waiting vehicle, gunmen opened fire at close range. When the shooting stopped, 4 law officers were dead, along with Nash himself. Kansas City detectives William Grooms and Frank Hermanson were killed, as was Oklahoma Police Chief Otto Reed and federal agent Ray Caffrey. The gunmen escaped, leaving behind one of the bloodiest law enforcement losses of the era. The attack stunned the country and immediately drew national attention. Charles Floyd and his associate Adam Ricchetti were quickly identified by federal authorities as primary suspects. The Bureau of Investigation, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, publicly tied them to the massacre and used the incident to justify expanded federal power and resources. Evidence cited included their presence in the Kansas City area at the time and later underworld claims. However, the case was never settled cleanly. Eyewitness accounts were inconsistent. Physical evidence was limited, and several contemporary and later investigators disputed Floyd's involvement. Floyd himself denied taking part, both publicly and privately, and members of his family maintained that he admitted to other crimes but not this one. The massacre marked a decisive shift in how Floyd was pursued. Regardless of unresolved questions about his role, the killings hardened federal resolve and reshaped his standing with law enforcement. From that day forward, Floyd was no longer hunted only as a bank robber and escaped convict. He was now linked, fairly or not, to one of the most infamous law enforcement slayings in American history, and the pressure to bring him down intensified accordingly. In the months that followed the Kansas City Massacre, the pursuit of Charles Floyd shifted from regional policing to a coordinated national hunt. The Bureau of Investigation placed him at the top of its priority list, treating him as a roaming threat rather than a criminal tied to any one state. His name began circulating through federal bulletins, reward posters, and interagency briefings, and every reported sighting was treated as credible. J. Edgar Hoover used the outrage surrounding the massacre to push for broader authority and greater resources for the Bureau. The case became a public justification for expanding federal reach, standardizing firearms training, and encouraging more aggressive pursuit of armed fugitives. Floyd's alleged connection to the killings at Union Station was repeatedly cited, even as questions about his actual involvement remained unresolved. For Hoover, the distinction mattered less than the opportunity to demonstrate federal resolve. As 1933 moved into its final months, Floyd found himself hunted on a scale he had never faced before. State lines no longer offered protection, and local officers were instructed to cooperate fully with federal agents. The pressure forced Floyd to stay constantly on the move, relying on a shrinking circle of associates and sympathetic locals. The man who had once slipped through gaps between jurisdictions was now pursued by a system that was rapidly learning how to close them. By July of 1934, the landscape of federal law enforcement had shifted again. John Dillinger was dead, shot outside a Chicago theater, and the Bureau of Investigation needed a new symbol for its war on interstate crime. J. Edgar Hoover filled that void by naming Charles Floyd Public Enemy Number 1. The designation was more than a title. It was a signal that Floyd now stood at the center of federal attention, the man whose capture or death would demonstrate the Bureau's growing power. With the label came intensified pressure, rewards increased, coordination between state and federal officers tightened, and Floyd's photograph circulated nationwide. Hoover used the announcement to reinforce the Bureau's public image as a modern, aggressive force capable of confronting heavily armed criminals. For Floyd, it meant there was no longer any margin left. Every robbery, every sighting, every rumor triggered an immediate response. By the summer of 1934, Floyd was no longer merely running from the law. He was being actively hunted as the federal government's most wanted man, and the distance between pursuit and reckoning was closing fast. On the night of October 18, 1934, Charles Floyd and Adam Richetti were on the move again, traveling through Ohio as they tried to stay ahead of the widening federal dragnet. In the early morning hours, heavy fog reduced visibility and Floyd lost control of their vehicle. The car slid off the road and struck a telephone pole, leaving it disabled but not drawing immediate attention. Neither man was injured, but the crash stranded them in unfamiliar territory at the worst possible time. Unable to drive, Floyd and Richetti sent their female companions into town to arrange for a tow and repairs, while they waited near the roadside. By daylight on October 19th, their presence had been noticed. 2 local motorists found the situation suspicious and alerted police in Wellsville, Ohio. Officers responded and began questioning the men, quickly realizing they were dealing with armed fugitives. When law enforcement approached, Richetti bolted into the woods, drawing officers after him. Floyd stayed behind and opened fire, wounding 2 policemen before escaping into the surrounding forest. A manhunt followed, involving local officers who knew the terrain. Richetti was soon cornered, captured, and taken into custody. Floyd once again slipped away. The split was decisive. Ricetti's capture removed Floyd's closest remaining partner and confirmed that the hunt was reaching its final stage. Floyd was now alone, wounded by proximity if not by bullets, and surrounded by alerted police departments and incoming federal agents. The escape brought him only a few days. The space between flight and confrontation had narrowed to almost nothing. On October 22, 1934, the pursuit of Charles Floyd came to an end near East Liverpool, Ohio. After days on the run following the Wellsville shootout, Floyd made his way into the area on foot and by stolen rides, trying to blend in long enough to get food and rest. That afternoon, local police and Bureau of Investigation agents closed in after receiving reports of a suspicious man moving through the countryside south of the city. Floyd was confronted near a farm and attempted to flee. He ran toward a cornfield, drawing his weapon as officers moved in. Gunfire erupted within moments. Floyd was struck multiple times and collapsed among the rows of corn. He was placed under arrest while still alive, but was mortally wounded and died shortly afterward. He was 30 years old. What followed was years of dispute over exactly how the shooting unfolded. Federal agents stated that Floyd emerged armed and was shot during an exchange of gunfire, insisting that only BOI personnel fired the fatal shots. Local officers later gave a different account, claiming Floyd had already been wounded and disarmed when additional shots were fired at close range. Those conflicting versions were never fully reconciled. No independent reconstructions settled the question of who fired the final bullets or in what sequence. What is clear is that the manhunt ended there, in a quiet Ohio cornfield. The chase that had stretched across states and years was over, and the federal government's most wanted fugitive was dead. Floyd left behind a record of robberies, confirmed killings, disputed accusations, and a legend that would continue to outgrow the facts long after the gunfire stopped. In the days following Charles Floyd's death, the focus shifted from pursuit to spectacle. On October 23, 1934, his body was taken to a funeral home in East Liverpool, Ohio, where it was embalmed and placed on public view. Despite objections from his family, word spread quickly, and thousands of people lined up to see the man who had dominated headlines for years. The crowds overwhelmed the area, damaging property and forcing authorities to manage the scene as if it were a public event rather than a private viewing. Floyd's body was then transported back to Oklahoma, the place that had shaped him and where much of his legend had taken hold. In Sallisaw, his remains were again placed on display, drawing enormous crowds. Estimates range from 20,000 to 40,000 people who came to view the body and attend the funeral, making it the largest funeral in Oklahoma history. Farmers, laborers, families, and curiosity seekers gathered not to celebrate crime, but to witness the end of a figure who had come to represent anger, defiance, and survival during the worst years of the Great Depression. When Floyd was buried near Athens, the divide between fact and folklore was already set. Law enforcement saw the closing of a violent chapter. Many in the crowd saw something else entirely, the burial of a man they believed had struck back at institutions that had failed them. The funeral cemented Charles Floyd's place in American memory, ensuring that his story would be argued, romanticized, and contested long after the crowds dispersed. In the years after Charles Floyd was buried, his life split cleanly into two parallel versions that never fully rejoined. One was grounded in record. Court documents, police reports, and federal files show a man responsible for dozens of bank robberies, multiple confirmed killings, and repeated escapes from custody. These records leave no doubt that Floyd chose violence as a tool and accepted the risks that came with it. Law enforcement viewed him as a persistent threat, and by the time of his death, he had become a symbol of everything federal authorities were determined to eliminate. The other version of Floyd lived in memory and story. During the Great Depression, tales spread that he destroyed mortgage papers during robberies or used stolen money to feed struggling families. These claims were never verified, and historians have been clear that they cannot be supported by reliable evidence. Still, the stories endured, especially in eastern Oklahoma, where resentment toward banks and foreclosures ran deep. In that environment, Floyd was recast as the Robin Hood of the Cookson Hills, a figure shaped as much by economic anger as by fact. Nowhere is the divide more evident than in the debate over the Kansas City Massacre. Federal authorities maintained Floyd's involvement, while later investigators and multiple contemporaries challenged that conclusion. No court ever ruled on his role, and no definitive evidence settled the question. The uncertainty remains, and it continues to color how Floyd is judged. What remains is a life that resists simple conclusions. Floyd was neither the folk hero celebrated in song, nor a criminal defined by myth alone. He was a product of poverty, opportunity, and choice, shaped by the conditions of his time and responsible for the harm he caused. The legend grew larger than the man, but the record remains. And it tells a story that is far more complicated than either side ever wanted to admit.